Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are pulling back the curtain on a story that should make every one of us deeply uncomfortable. In Singapore, one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, migrant workers, the people who literally built that gleaming skyline, are being transported to job sites in caged lorries. Metal cages bolted onto the backs of trucks. Doors locked from the outside. And it took until 2026 for anyone in power to say maybe that's not okay.
I'm Maya Clarity, and Alex, when I first read this story from the South China Morning Post, I had to read it twice. Not because the facts were complicated, but because the image is so stark. We are talking about human beings locked inside metal enclosures on the back of open trucks, in tropical heat, with no way to escape if something goes wrong. And the so-called reform that Singapore just announced? It barely scratches the surface. Tonight, we are going deep on what this tells us about how the world actually treats its migrant labor force.
We've also got a story about iOS security vulnerabilities that the federal government cybersecurity agency just flagged as actively exploited in the wild. Now you might ask, what does a phone exploit have to do with immigration? Stay with us, because the history of mobile surveillance and its use against vulnerable migrant populations is a thread we absolutely need to pull on. And we'll connect all of this to the broader systems of power that keep certain people invisible and disposable.
Plus, we'll look at how corporate giants continue to shift terms and conditions on consumers, specifically Tesla and its full self-driving transfer policies, because it fits a pattern we see over and over: institutions making promises to attract people, then quietly rewriting the rules once they're locked in. Sound familiar? It should, because that's the story of migrant labor contracts worldwide.
So buckle up. This is Truth Report, and tonight we are following the money, the power, and the cages. Let's get into it.
Our lead story tonight comes out of Singapore, reported by the South China Morning Post. Senior Minister of State for Transport Sun Xueling announced that Singapore will be moving to ban caged lorry decks, those metal enclosures bolted onto the flatbeds of trucks that are used to ferry migrant workers to and from construction sites and other workplaces across the island nation.
Let's be precise about what we're talking about here, because the language matters. These are not buses. These are not passenger vehicles. These are open-bed cargo trucks, and someone decided the most efficient way to move human beings was to weld a metal cage onto the back and lock the door from the outside. Minister Sun acknowledged that these caged doors pose, and I'm quoting here, additional safety risks to passengers sitting in the rear. She specifically cited the scenario of a lorry with a caged door that is locked or latched from the outside being involved in an accident or a fire.
And let's sit with that for a moment, Alex. The government's own minister is acknowledging that if one of these trucks catches fire or gets into a collision, the workers in the back cannot get out. They are literally locked in. This isn't some activist's hypothetical, this is the government's own stated rationale for the policy change. The question that should be screaming at all of us is, how was this ever legal in the first place? How did one of the most regulated, most orderly countries on the planet look at locked metal cages on the backs of trucks and say, yes, that meets our safety standards for transporting people?
And that's where the story gets really uncomfortable, because the answer is simple. These aren't just any people. These are migrant workers, predominantly from South Asia, Bangladesh, India, and other countries in the region. Singapore's economy runs on migrant labor. We're talking about an estimated 300,000 or more foreign workers in the construction sector alone. They build the skyscrapers, maintain the infrastructure, and keep the city-state functioning. And the implicit social contract has been, we'll let you come here and earn more than you could at home, but don't expect to be treated like you belong here.
The activist response to this announcement has been pointed and, frankly, justified. Groups that advocate for migrant worker rights in Singapore have said that while banning caged doors is a step, it completely fails to address the fundamental problem: workers are still going to be transported on the open backs of lorries. No seatbelts. No crash protection. Sitting on metal benches or wooden planks with nothing between them and the road except the sides of a truck bed. The cage is gone, but the danger remains.
Think about this from a pure safety engineering perspective. In Singapore, every citizen and permanent resident rides in vehicles with seatbelts, airbags, crumple zones, all the safety features we take for granted. But migrant workers? They ride in the back of open trucks. The double standard is not hidden. It is literally visible on the streets every single morning and evening during shift changes. You can see the gleaming sedans and the workers packed into truck beds sharing the same roads. Two classes of human being, separated by sheet metal and a work permit.
And the data backs up how dangerous this is. Lorry accidents involving migrant workers are a recurring issue in Singapore. Workers have been killed and seriously injured when these vehicles are involved in collisions. Because they're sitting in an open or caged truck bed, Even a relatively minor fender bender can throw workers from the vehicle or crush them against the cage structure. The fatality and injury rates for this mode of transport are dramatically higher than for any enclosed passenger vehicle. But because the victims are foreign workers, these incidents rarely make front-page news.
What really gets me is the economic argument, Maya. Singapore is one of the richest countries per capita in the world. The GDP per capita is over $80,000. The construction companies using these workers are generating enormous profits. The cost of providing proper buses or enclosed vehicles for worker transport is a rounding error on these companies' balance sheets. This is not a resource problem. This is a priorities problem. It is cheaper to cage workers than to bus them, and for decades, nobody with power cared enough to change that.
And let's talk about the system that makes this possible, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Singapore's migrant worker system operates on a work permit framework that ties workers to a single employer. If you're a construction worker from Bangladesh, you likely paid thousands of dollars to a recruitment agent to get your job. You may be in debt. Your passport may be held by your employer, a practice that is technically illegal but widely reported. So when your boss says get in the cage truck, you get in the cage truck. You don't file a complaint. You don't call a hotline. Because the entire structure of your existence in that country depends on your employer's goodwill.
This is the part that connects Singapore's story to the global immigration picture. Everywhere in the world where you find large populations of migrant workers, the Gulf states, parts of East Asia, even agricultural sectors in the United States and Europe, you find this same dynamic. The legal framework creates dependency. The economic structure creates vulnerability. And the social system creates invisibility. Workers are essential but unseen. Valued for their labor but not as people. The caged lorry in Singapore is the most literal, most visual symbol of that system, but the cage is everywhere. It's just usually made of policy and paperwork instead of steel.
So what happens next with this ban? According to the reporting, the Singapore government is phasing out caged lorry decks, but there's been criticism about the timeline and the scope. Activists want a comprehensive overhaul of how migrant workers are transported, meaning a shift to proper enclosed vehicles, with seatbelts and safety features. The government's move addresses only the cage door issue, not the underlying practice of transporting people on open truck beds. It's a bit like removing the padlock from a prison cell but leaving the bars in place.
And the broader context here is that Singapore has faced increasing international scrutiny over its treatment of migrant workers, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic. When the pandemic hit, Singapore's migrant worker dormitories became massive infection hotspots. Workers were packed into cramped rooms, sometimes 12 or 20 to a room, and the virus tore through these facilities. It exposed to the world what advocates have been saying for years, that Singapore's migrant worker infrastructure was built for cost efficiency, not for human dignity. The caged lorries are part of that same infrastructure of neglect.
It's worth noting that Singapore is far from the worst offender when it comes to migrant worker treatment. The Gulf states of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, have faced far more severe allegations, including outright forced labor and deaths on construction projects like the FIFA World Cup stadiums. But Singapore's case is particularly instructive because it shows that even in a well-governed, wealthy, rule-of-law society, migrant workers can still be treated as something less than fully human. If Singapore can't get this right, what hope is there for places with far less institutional capacity?
Now, let's pivot to our second story, because I want to draw a connection that might not be immediately obvious. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, has added 3 iOS vulnerabilities to its catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities. Reporting from Ars Technica describes these as part of a large assembly of advanced iOS exploits that have been used under what the outlet calls mysterious circumstances.
Here's why this matters for our immigration focus, Alex. Over the past several years, we have seen repeated, documented cases of mobile phone vulnerabilities being exploited to surveil journalists, activists, and human rights defenders, including those who work on immigration and migrant rights issues. The most notorious example is the Pegasus spyware developed by NSO Group, which was found on the phones of people working on behalf of migrants and refugees across multiple countries.
The connection between phone surveillance and immigration isn't theoretical, it's documented. Governments have used mobile exploits to track asylum seekers, monitor immigration attorneys, and spy on advocacy organizations. When CISA flags iOS vulnerabilities as actively exploited in the wild, the first question every immigration advocate should ask is, who is being targeted? Because the history here is clear. These tools do not stay in the hands of people who use them responsibly. They end up being turned on the most vulnerable populations, including migrants and the people who try to help them.
What Ars Technica describes is a pattern we've seen before: sophisticated exploits that require significant resources to develop, being deployed against targets that suggest state-level involvement. The article references the long, strange history of iOS exploit chains, and that history includes documented use against civil society. The fact that CISA is now formally cataloging these vulnerabilities means the federal government acknowledges they're being actively weaponized. The question, as always, is against whom?
And here's where it connects to our Singapore story. Whether it's a physical cage on the back of a truck or a digital cage in someone's phone, the through line is control. Systems of power use whatever tools are available to maintain control over vulnerable populations. For migrant workers, that might mean a work permit system that chains you to an employer, or it might mean surveillance software that monitors your communications. The technology changes, but the purpose is the same, to keep certain people watched, contained, and compliant.
We should be clear that we don't have specific evidence linking these particular iOS vulnerabilities to immigration surveillance operations. But we do have extensive evidence that the broader category of mobile exploits has been repeatedly used for exactly that purpose. And when you see federal agencies flagging new exploits as actively used in the wild, responsible journalism requires us to ask the hard questions about who the targets are, especially when history gives us such troubling precedents.
The third dimension of tonight's coverage might seem like an unusual fit, but bear with me. CleanTechnica reports that Tesla has quietly updated its terms and conditions for transferring its full self-driving software package between vehicles. This is significant for electric truck buyers who paid thousands of dollars for FSD with the expectation that certain transfer rights would apply, only to find the rules changed underneath them.
Alex, I know some viewers are wondering what Tesla's business practices have to do with immigration. But the pattern here is one that migrant workers around the world know intimately. It's the bait and switch. You're promised one set of terms when you sign up, when you pay your money, when you commit, and then the terms change after you're already locked in. For Tesla buyers, the stakes are financial. For migrant workers, the stakes can be their freedom, their safety, and their lives.
Think about how recruitment works for migrant labor. A worker in Bangladesh is told by an agent, here's the salary, here are the working conditions, here's what your life will look like in Singapore or Dubai or wherever. They pay thousands of dollars in recruitment fees, money they often borrow from family or moneylenders. They arrive in the destination country and discover the salary is lower, the hours are longer, the housing is a packed dormitory, and the transportation to work is a caged lorry. The terms changed, but they're already committed. They can't walk away without losing everything they invested.
CleanTechnica describes Tesla's approach as bait and switch, noting that the company has a pattern of making promises to attract buyers, then quietly revising the conditions. The article references the frustration of electric truck buyers who feel trapped by changing terms. And this is exactly the mechanism that traps migrant workers globally. The recruitment agent promises one thing. The employer delivers another. The legal system that's supposed to protect you actually protects the employer. And you have no practical way to seek recourse because the power imbalance is too great.
The article specifically discusses how Tesla's FSD transfer policies have been repeatedly modified, creating confusion and frustration among consumers who made purchasing decisions based on earlier promises. In the corporate world, we call this anti-consumer behavior, and regulators eventually step in. In the immigration world, we call it labor exploitation, and regulators often look the other way. But the mechanism is identical: change the terms after someone has committed resources they can't recover.
And there's a labor angle to the Tesla story itself that shouldn't be ignored. The electric vehicle industry, the battery supply chain, the mining of lithium and cobalt, these industries rely heavily on migrant labor and labor in the global south. When we talk about electric trucks and the consumer experience, we should also be asking about the workers who built those trucks, who mined those materials, who assembled those batteries. The bait and switch isn't just happening at the point of sale, it's happening at every level of the supply chain, from the cobalt mines of the Congo to the factory floors.
So let's bring all of this together, because that's what Truth Report does. We don't just cover stories, we connect them. And tonight, the connection is a single, uncomfortable word: disposability. In Singapore, migrant workers are essential enough to build a world-class city but disposable enough to transport in cages. In the digital surveillance landscape, vulnerable populations are important enough to spy on but disposable enough to deny legal protections. In corporate terms and conditions, consumers are valuable enough to recruit but disposable enough to deceive once they've committed.
The pattern Alex is identifying runs through every institution in our global system. It's the fundamental contradiction of modern capitalism applied to human beings. You are valuable as a unit of labor or a unit of consumption, but your dignity, safety, and autonomy are externalities, costs to be minimized. And migrant workers sit at the very bottom of this hierarchy because they have the least political power, the least legal protection, and the most to lose by speaking up.
What struck me most about the Singapore story is how long it took. Caged lorries have been transporting workers for decades. Advocates have been raising alarms for years. Workers have been injured and killed. And it took until 2026 for the government to address even the most extreme version of the problem, the locked cage door. Not the open truck beds. Not the lack of seatbelts. Just the locked door. That timeline tells you everything you need to know about where migrant workers sit in the political priority list.
And the iOS vulnerability story reminds us that the tools of control are evolving. It used to be that you controlled migrant workers through physical means, confiscating passports, restricting movement, housing them in isolated dormitories. Now you can also monitor their phones, read their messages, track their locations. The cage has gone digital. And the legal frameworks that are supposed to protect privacy and civil liberties were not designed with the world's most vulnerable populations in mind. They were designed to protect citizens. Migrants, asylum seekers, undocumented people, they fall through the cracks.
I want our audience to think about what it means that we live in a world where a country can be simultaneously celebrated as a model of good governance and criticized for locking human beings in cages during their daily commute. That contradiction is not a bug in the system, it is the system. The good governance applies to citizens. The cages apply to workers who are explicitly excluded from full participation in that society. Two sets of rules, one country, perfectly functional.
And this is not just Singapore's problem. In the United States, agricultural workers, many of them immigrants, face similar double standards. They are essential enough that the food system collapses without them, but their working conditions, housing standards, and transportation safety would be considered unacceptable for any other workforce. The caged lorry is a particularly vivid image, but the principle is the same everywhere. Migrant workers receive a lower standard of treatment because the political system allows it and the economic system demands it.
So what's the solution? Advocates in Singapore are pushing for proper enclosed transport vehicles with full safety features. That's the immediate, practical demand, and it should be non-negotiable. But the deeper solution requires rethinking the entire framework of how we treat migrant labor. Work permits shouldn't tie people to single employers. Recruitment fees should be paid by employers, not workers. Housing and transportation standards should be the same regardless of immigration status. And surveillance tools should be regulated to prevent their use against civil society.
Those are policy changes that require political will, and political will requires public pressure, and public pressure requires stories like these to be told. That's why we do what we do here at Truth Report. Because the caged lorry only persists as long as people don't see it. The surveillance only works as long as people don't know about it. The bait and switch only succeeds as long as people don't connect the dots. Our job is to make sure you see it, know about it, and connect those dots.
Before we go, I want to come back to something Minister Sun Shuling said in that announcement. She specifically described a scenario where a lorry with a caged door that is locked or latched from the outside is involved in an accident or a fire. She's describing a death trap. She is using the clinical language of government to describe a scenario where human beings burn to death because they can't open a door. And the fact that this scenario was apparently acceptable until 2026 is an indictment not just of Singapore's transport policy, but of every system that treats migrant workers as less deserving of basic safety than everyone else.
Absolutely, Alex. And I want our audience to carry that image with them. Not to demonize Singapore specifically, but to recognize the caged lorry in their own communities. What's the equivalent in your country? What do the workers who pick your food, build your houses, and clean your offices ride in? What are their safety protections? What are their legal rights? Because the cage takes different forms in different places, but the principle is universal. The people who do the hardest work for the lowest pay receive the least protection. And that's a choice we all make by accepting it silently.
That's going to do it for tonight's Truth Report. We covered Singapore's long overdue move to ban caged lorry decks for migrant workers, the federal government flagging actively exploited iOS vulnerabilities with troubling surveillance implications, and corporate practices that mirror the bait-and-switch dynamics that trap workers worldwide. The common thread, the systems of power that promise one thing and deliver another, especially to those least able to fight back.
If these stories matter to you, share them. Talk about them. Push your representatives to take migrant worker rights seriously, not as a partisan issue, but as a basic human dignity issue. The workers in those cages didn't choose to be there. They chose to feed their families, and the system put them in the cage. It's on all of us to demand that the cage comes down, all of it, not just the door.
I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity.
And this has been Truth Report. Stay informed, stay critical, and never stop asking who benefits when certain people are kept invisible. Good night.
Good night, everyone. We'll see you next time.